The silence was deafening after they slammed the door. Every word they'd ever said to me, every promise, every moment of what I thought was love, echoed in my ears, twisting into a mocking symphony of betrayal. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely feel the cold tile beneath my bare feet, the reality of their decision crashing down on me like a tidal wave. They were gone, and I was alone, adrift in a sea of disbelief, with nothing but the clothes on my back and the bitter taste of abandonment coating my tongue. If you've ever felt betrayed by your own father, subscribe to this channel and become part of our family. We share stories of resilience and payback so you never feel alone. Click the subscribe button now. My name is Jennifer, and until this morning, I thought I had a family, a normal one. Maybe not perfect, but a family nonetheless. We lived in a big, sprawling house in Connecticut, the kind with a perfectly manicured lawn and a 3-car garage. My parents, Richard and Emily, were pillars of the community, always hosting charity events, attending church every Sunday, and volunteering at the local soup kitchen. They projected an image of generosity and compassion, but behind closed doors, a different story unfolded. Growing up, I was always pressured to excel, to be the perfect daughter. Straight A's were expected, not celebrated. Any deviation from their meticulously crafted plan for my life was met with disapproval, and increasingly with thinly veiled contempt. I tried. I really did. I poured my heart and soul into everything they wanted, sacrificing my own passions and interests at the altar of their expectations. But it was never enough. There was always another hurdle, another standard to meet, another way in which I fell short. I wanted to study art history, but they said it was a waste of my potential and pushed me towards pre-med. I wanted to travel, but they said it was irresponsible and insisted I focus on building a stable career. Every dream I had was systematically dismantled, every aspiration crushed under the weight of their ambition. Things escalated when I told them I was dating someone they disapproved of. Michael wasn't rich, he wasn't from the right family, and he certainly didn't fit into their grand scheme for my future. They made their displeasure known from the start, subtly at first, with pointed remarks and disapproving glances, but their disapproval soon morphed into outright hostility. They began to monitor my phone calls, question my whereabouts, and even forbade me from seeing Michael altogether. I tried to reason with them, to explain that Michael made me happy, that he understood me in a way they never had. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. They were convinced that they knew what was best for me, that Michael was a threat to their carefully constructed vision of my life. The final blow came when they discovered that Michael and I were planning to move in together. The fury that erupted was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. They accused me of being ungrateful, of throwing away my future, of betraying their trust. They said that if I chose Michael, I was choosing to abandon my family. I foolishly believed there was still room for reconciliation, that somehow they would come around. I was wrong. That night, after a screaming match that shook the very foundations of our home, they gave me an ultimatum: end things with Michael or leave. I stood my ground. I couldn't betray Michael. I couldn't keep living a lie. And that's when they did it. They packed my bags, dragged them to the front door, and tossed me out into the cold. The person I trusted most was one of them. The click of the lock was the final punctuation mark on that chapter of my life. I stood there, a statue of shock in the Connecticut night, until the cold seeped into my bones, jolting me back to reality. My phone was dead, my purse was still inside, and the only solace I had was the threadbare sweater I'd thrown on before the screaming started. I walked. I walked until my legs burned and my lungs ached, the manicured lawns of my former life slowly giving way to the anonymous glow of the highway. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by the gnawing anxiety that coiled in my stomach like a venomous snake. Where would I go? How would I survive? Every step was a heavy reminder of my parents' rejection, their willingness to cast me aside like a broken toy. I found a 24-hour diner a few miles away, the greasy smell of stale coffee and frying bacon, a strange comfort in the face of my despair. I used their payphone. Yes, an actual payphone, a relic of a bygone era, to call Michael. His voice, thick with sleep, was the first kindness I'd heard in what felt like a lifetime. He didn't hesitate. He told me to stay put, that he'd be there as soon as he could. Waiting for him felt like an eternity. Each passing car was a potential threat, each shadow a lurking monster. When his beat-up Honda finally pulled into the parking lot, I ran to him, collapsing into his arms in a flood of tears. He held me tight, whispering reassurances into my hair, his warmth a shield against the cold, cruel world. Michael's apartment was a small, cramped studio in a less than desirable part of town, a far cry from the sprawling mansion I'd grown up in. But it was safe, it was warm, and it was filled with Michael's unwavering love. He gave me the clothes off his back, shared his meager meals, and listened patiently as I recounted the events of the night, my voice trembling with anger and despair. He didn't try to minimize my pain or offer empty platitudes. He simply held me and let me cry, his presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. The next few weeks were a blur of job applications, ramen noodles, and sleepless nights.
I haunted coffee shops with free Wi-Fi, desperately searching for any opportunity to prove myself, to build a life independent of my parents' suffocating control. Rejection after rejection piled up, each one chipping away at my already fragile self-esteem. The weight of my parents' disapproval hung over me like a dark cloud, their voices echoing in my head, telling me I was worthless, incapable, a failure. I tried to reach out to them, to bridge the gap that had widened into a chasm. I sent emails, wrote letters, even drove by the house a few times, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, to plead my case. But my efforts were met with silence. Their doors remained closed. Their hearts hardened against me. The realization that they were truly done with me was a devastating blow, a wound that cut deeper than I ever thought possible. My mother, a woman who had always preached forgiveness and compassion, had completely shut me out. My father, a man who had built his empire on ruthless ambition, had discarded me without a second thought. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. They had raised me to be the person I was, shaped my values, and instilled in me the very principles that led me to choose love over their twisted version of success. And now, they were punishing me for it. I started having nightmares, vivid dreams of being trapped in the house, unable to escape their judgment. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the silence of Michael's apartment amplifying my fear. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of their expectations, their disapproval, their complete and utter rejection. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let their cruelty define me. I had to find a way to reclaim my life, to prove to myself and to them that I was stronger than they ever imagined. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about survival. It was about proving that I wouldn't just survive, but that I would thrive in the face of their spite. The fire of revenge started as a flicker, but it was growing, fed by the pain and injustice they inflicted. And I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't rest until they faced the consequences of their actions. They thought they had broken me. They were wrong. They had just lit the fuse. Drowning in debt, struggling to make ends meet, our future as uncertain as ever. I stared at the bills, my vision blurring, the room spinning around me. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. I stumbled into the bathroom, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to regain some semblance of composure, but it was no use. The reflection staring back at me was a stranger, a hollow-eyed, haunted version of the girl I used to be. I looked at the medicine cabinet, my mind racing. There were pills there, sleeping pills Michael had been prescribed for his insomnia. A dark thought flickered in my mind, a tempting whisper promising sweet release from the pain. It would be so easy, a way out of the misery, a way to end the suffering. I reached for the bottle, my fingers trembling as I unscrewed the cap. I hesitated, the pills rattling in my palm like tiny bones. Was this really the answer? Was this what my parents wanted? To see me broken, defeated, Ready to give up? A wave of anger washed over me, a surge of defiance that pushed back the darkness. No, I wouldn't let them win. I wouldn't let their cruelty define me. I slammed the bottle back into the cabinet, the sound echoing in the small room. I sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, the weight of my despair pressing down on me. But amidst the tears, a spark ignited, a flicker of resolve, a refusal to be broken. I would fight. I would survive. I would prove them wrong. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the bathroom, my mind racing, the seed of a plan beginning to sprout. I couldn't keep living like this, scraping by, dependent on Michael's generosity. I needed to take control of my life, to find a way to reclaim my independence. But how? My parents had systematically dismantled my dreams, steering me away from my passions, forcing me down a path I never wanted to take. I had no marketable skills, no real-world experience, no connections to rely on. I was trapped, a bird with clipped wings, unable to soar. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale glow through the window, I remembered something my grandmother used to say: "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade." It was a cliché, I knew, but in that moment it resonated with a newfound power. My parents had given me lemons, a bitter, twisted harvest of rejection and betrayal, but I wouldn't let them define my fate. I would find a way to turn their negativity into something positive, to use their cruelty as fuel for my own success. I thought about their lives, their meticulously crafted image of perfection, their obsession with wealth and status. They had built their empire on lies and manipulation, concealing their true selves behind a facade of generosity and compassion. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that their greatest fear was exposure. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, a surge of excitement that banished the last vestiges of despair.
I had found their weakness. Their biggest weakness? They thought they were untouchable. They believed they were above reproach, immune to the consequences of their actions, and that arrogance would be their undoing. I started to think about all the things I knew about them, the secrets they had tried so hard to keep hidden, the shady business deals, the extramarital affairs, the lies they had told to protect their reputation. It was all there, simmering beneath the surface, a treasure trove of ammunition waiting to be unleashed. I knew it wouldn't be easy. They were powerful, influential people with resources to spare, but I was determined. I would gather evidence, document their misdeeds, and expose them for the frauds they truly were. It wouldn't bring back the love I had lost, but it would give me something else, a sense of justice, a feeling of control, a way to reclaim my life. The first step was to start collecting information. I needed to find proof of their wrongdoing, to build a case that was airtight and undeniable. I knew it would be risky, that they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, but I was no longer afraid. The fear had been replaced by a cold, calculating determination, a burning desire to make them pay for what they had done. I started by creating a separate email account, using a fake name and a secure server. I knew they were likely monitoring my communications, so I had to be careful, to cover my tracks at every turn. I spent hours online, researching their business dealings, scouring public records, looking for any sign of impropriety. It was slow, painstaking work, but I was relentless, driven by a need to uncover the truth. I started small, focusing on their charitable donations, their tax filings, their public statements. I compared their words with their actions, looking for discrepancies, for any hint of deception. And slowly, painstakingly, I began to find them. Small inconsistencies at first, minor discrepancies that could be easily explained away. But as I dug deeper, the cracks began to widen, revealing a pattern of deceit and manipulation that was both shocking and infuriating. They had been lying for years, systematically defrauding their investors, evading taxes, and exploiting their employees. And they had gotten away with it because no one had ever dared to question them. Until now. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings, late-night research sessions, and nerve-wracking close calls. I felt like a spy in a movie, constantly looking over my shoulder, paranoid that I was being watched. But I couldn't stop. The more I uncovered, the more determined I became to expose their lies. I started documenting everything, creating a detailed file of their misdeeds, complete with dates, times, and supporting documents. I knew that if I was going to take them down, I needed to be prepared, to have irrefutable evidence to back up my claims. I even considered contacting a lawyer, but I was afraid of being exposed,
of alerting my parents to my plans. I decided to wait, to gather as much evidence as possible before making my move. One day, while sifting through old newspaper articles, I stumbled across a story about a lawsuit filed against my father's company several years earlier. The lawsuit had been settled out of court, and the details were sealed, but the article hinted at serious allegations of fraud and misconduct. I knew I had to find out more. I spent days searching for information about the lawsuit, scouring court records, contacting former employees, trying to piece together the puzzle. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but I refused to give up. And then, one night, I hit pay dirt. I found a contact, a former employee who had been involved in the lawsuit, a man who had been silenced by a non-disclosure agreement. I reached out to him, using my fake email address, and cautiously explained my situation. To my surprise, he agreed to meet with me. He was hesitant at first, afraid of the consequences of breaking his agreement, but I convinced him that it was time for the truth to come out. We met in a secluded coffee shop, far from my parents' sphere of influence. He was a nervous, fidgety man, his eyes darting around the room, but he had information, valuable information. He told me about the fraud, the lies, the manipulation that had been used to silence him. He gave me copies of documents, emails, and memos that proved my father's guilt. It was everything I needed, the final piece of the puzzle. As I walked away from the coffee shop, clutching the documents in my hand, I felt a surge of power, a sense of triumph that washed away the last vestiges of doubt. I had them. I had everything I needed to bring them down. The plan was in motion. The revenge was coming. The documents felt like a ticking time bomb in my hands. I knew I couldn't sit on them. I had to act, but not recklessly. I needed a plan, a strategy that would ensure maximum impact with minimal risk to myself, and more importantly, to Michael. I spent days locked in the apartment, poring over the evidence, analyzing every detail, searching for the perfect angle of attack. I researched defamation laws, fraud statutes, and securities regulations, learning how to navigate the legal minefield that my parents had so expertly constructed around themselves. I knew they would come after me with everything they had, so I needed to be prepared to defend myself. My initial thought was to leak the documents to the press, to expose their crimes to the world. But I quickly realized that this would be too messy, too unpredictable. They had powerful connections in the media, and they could easily bury the story or discredit me. I needed a more controlled approach, a way to deliver the evidence directly to the authorities without exposing myself prematurely.
I started exploring the possibility of filing an anonymous complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the government agency responsible for regulating the stock market. I learned that they had a whistleblower program that offered significant financial rewards for information leading to successful prosecutions. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try. The problem was that filing a credible complaint required more than just the documents I had obtained. I needed to provide a detailed analysis of the fraud to explain how it worked, who was involved, and what the financial impact was. This meant I needed to become an expert in their business, to understand their accounting practices, and to decipher their complex financial statements. It was a daunting task, but I was determined to learn everything I needed to know. I started spending hours online, researching their industry, studying their competitors, and analyzing their financial performance. I downloaded their annual reports, their SEC filings, and their press releases, dissecting every number, every word, every comma. I taught myself accounting principles, financial modeling, and forensic analysis. I even enrolled in an online course on securities fraud investigation. Michael, bless his heart, didn't understand what I was doing, but he supported me every step of the way. He brought me coffee, cooked me meals, and listened patiently as I ranted about balance sheets and income statements. He was my rock, my anchor in the storm. As I delved deeper into their financial records, I discovered even more evidence of wrongdoing. They had been systematically inflating their profits, concealing their debts, and manipulating their stock price. They had been running a Ponzi scheme right under the noses of the regulators. The audacity of their crimes was staggering. I knew I had to stop them, not just for myself, but for everyone they had harmed. I started building a case, a detailed narrative of their fraud, complete with charts, graphs, and supporting documentation. I organized the evidence chronologically, highlighting the key events, the critical transactions, and the individuals involved. I wanted to make it easy for the SEC to understand the fraud and to prosecute the perpetrators. I knew that my parents would likely monitor my online activity, so I had to ensure they would not get any wind of what I was up to.
To prevent my parents from intercepting my communications, I routed all my traffic through a virtual private network, VPN, located in another country. I also used encryption software to protect my files and emails. To further safeguard my work, I created a decoy project on my computer, a fake business plan for a new company that I pretended to be working on. This way, if anyone snooped around, they would find nothing but harmless information. I also made sure to vary my online activity so I wouldn't raise any red flags.
I spent time browsing social media, watching videos, and shopping online. I wanted to appear as normal as possible, to blend in with the crowd. The whistleblower reward program also requires an original document, so I had to find one. I remembered my father often recording his phone calls. I decided to bug his office. The plan was taking shape. The bug was small, almost invisible, hidden inside a pen I accidentally left on my father's desk during a staged visit. I acted the part of the remorseful daughter, eager to mend fences, while my fingers fumbled with a pen, ensuring it was perfectly positioned to capture everything. The recordings were gold. My father, never suspecting a thing, spoke freely, discussing deals, strategies, and the occasional rant about his incompetent underlings. He even talked about the lawsuit, casually mentioning how he had taken care of the former employee by offering him a substantial sum in exchange for his silence and a signed non-disclosure agreement. It was all there, in crystal clear audio, the confession I needed to seal their fate. Listening to those recordings, a cold rage settled in my bones. It wasn't just about the money, the fraud, or the lies. It was about the casual cruelty, the utter lack of remorse, the way they treated people like pawns in their twisted game. I knew I had to be careful. They could trace the bug back to me if I wasn't smart. I decided to use a burner phone and a public Wi-Fi network to download the recordings and transfer them to my encrypted hard drive. I also made sure to erase any traces of my visit to his office, wiping down the pen and removing any fingerprints. With the recordings in hand, my case against them was rock solid. I had the documents, the analysis, and the confession. It was time to contact the SEC and blow the whistle. I drafted a detailed complaint, outlining the fraud, presenting the evidence, and explaining the financial impact. I included the recordings, transcripts, and supporting documents, leaving no stone unturned. Then, using my anonymous email account and a secure server, I submitted the complaint to the SEC, requesting whistleblower protection and a reward for my information. I knew it was a gamble, but I had nothing to lose. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. Days turned into weeks, and I heard nothing from the SEC. I started to worry that my complaint had been lost in the shuffle, or that my parents had somehow gotten wind of my plan and intervened. The waiting was agonizing. I tried to distract myself, to focus on other things, but my mind kept drifting back to the investigation, wondering if I had done enough, if I had made a mistake. Michael, sensing my anxiety, tried to reassure me. He told me to be patient, that justice would eventually prevail. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, one evening, as I was scrolling through the news, I saw it.
A headline that sent a chill down my spine. SEC investigating father's company for securities fraud. My heart leaped into my throat. They had taken the bait. The plan was working. But the article also mentioned that the SEC was working closely with my parents' legal team, cooperating with them to uncover the truth. A wave of panic washed over me. They knew. They knew it was me. I knew my parents wouldn't waste any time retaliating. They would use all their resources to discredit me, to silence me, to make me disappear. I had to act fast. I packed a bag, grabbed my laptop and hard drive, and prepared to disappear. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. It was no longer safe. As I was about to leave, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered it. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. "We know what you've done," a cold, menacing voice said on the other end. "And you will regret it." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking. They were watching me. They knew where I was. I had to get out of there. Now. I ran out of the apartment, clutching my bag, and headed for the nearest subway station. As I waited for the train, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the crowd, but I couldn't spot anyone suspicious. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't take any chances. I boarded the train and sat down in a corner seat, trying to blend in with the other passengers. As the train pulled away from the station, I noticed a man in a dark suit standing on the platform, staring directly at me. He had a cold, expressionless face, and his eyes were like chips of ice. I knew, with chilling certainty, that he was one of them. My heart pounded in my chest. I was trapped. I had to find a way to escape. As the train sped through the tunnel, I started formulating a plan. I would get off at the next stop and try to lose him in the crowd. It was a long shot, but it was my only hope. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and I jumped up and headed for the doors. As I stepped onto the platform, I saw the man in the dark suit emerging from the train, his eyes fixed on me. I turned and ran, pushing my way through the crowd, dodging commuters and sprinting towards the exit. I could hear his footsteps behind me, gaining ground. I burst out of the station and into the busy city street, weaving through traffic, dodging pedestrians, and trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and my pursuer. I glanced back and saw him still on my trail, his face grim, his pace relentless. I knew I couldn't outrun him forever. I needed to find a place to hide. I spotted a crowded marketplace ahead, a maze of stalls and shoppers. It was my best chance. I plunged into the crowd, disappearing into the throng of people, hoping to lose him in the chaos. I darted between stalls, ducking under awnings and squeezing through narrow gaps, trying to throw him off my scent. I could still hear his footsteps behind me, but they were getting fainter. I was starting to lose him. Just as I thought I was safe, I felt a hand grab my arm. I spun around and saw the man in the dark suit, his face inches from mine. "It's over," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "They want to see you." I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. He started dragging me towards a black car parked at the curb. I struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. He was too strong. As he shoved me into the car, I saw a familiar face in the back seat. My mother. Her eyes were like ice. "Hello, darling," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "We need to have a little chat." The car sped off into the night. The car ride was silent, my mother's gaze never leaving me. We arrived at their mansion, a gilded cage I once called home. They led me to the study, the room where so many deals and so many lives had been manipulated. My father sat behind his massive desk, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You thought you could outsmart us," he sneered, his voice dangerously low. "You were a naive, foolish girl." I said nothing, my silence fueled by the burning anger inside me. "We're going to make this very simple," my mother said, her voice like ice. "You're going to retract your complaint, and you're going to disappear. We'll make it worth your while." She slid a check across the desk. It was for a substantial amount, enough to set me up for life, but it was blood money. "I'm not interested," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It's over, and this ends tonight." My father slammed his fist on the desk, his face turning crimson. "You think you've won. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small USB drive. "Oh, I think I do," I said, a smile playing on my lips. "This contains all the evidence I sent to the SEC, along with a few extra surprises." I paused for effect. "I've also sent copies to several news organizations, with instructions to release them if anything happens to me." Their faces paled. They knew I wasn't bluffing. The power had shifted. "You wouldn't?" my mother gasped, her voice trembling. "Try me," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "I have nothing left to lose." The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My father, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice defeated. "I want the truth to come out," I said. "I want you to admit what you've done, and I want you to face the consequences." They tried to negotiate, to offer me deals, to plead with me, but I was unmoved. I had waited too long for this moment. "It's over," I repeated. "The game is over." The next few days were a whirlwind. The SEC investigation became public, and the news media descended upon my parents' company like vultures. The stock price plummeted, and their empire began to crumble. My parents tried to deny the allegations, to discredit me, to spin the story in their favor, but the evidence was overwhelming. The documents, the recordings, the testimony of former employees, it all pointed to their guilt. One by one, their allies abandoned them. Their friends turned their backs. Their lawyers distanced themselves. They were alone. I watched it all unfold from a safe distance, hidden away in a small apartment, my heart filled with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I knew that what I had done was necessary, But it didn't make it any easier. Seeing my parents' lives destroyed was a painful experience. They were going to face jail time, and the charges included violating numerous financial regulations. They were also facing a series of lawsuits by more former employees, shareholders, and business partners. The fallout was massive. Then came the day I saw their faces on television, being escorted into a courthouse in handcuffs. My father's face was ashen, his eyes hollow. My mother's face was tear-streaked, her hair disheveled. They looked like broken people, shadows of their former selves. It was a stark contrast to the image they had always projected, the image of power, wealth, and success. Seeing them brought low did not bring the satisfaction I had imagined. It was merely closure. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, but the outcome was never in doubt. My parents were found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and securities violations. They were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and their assets were seized. Their empire was gone, reduced to ashes. I received a whistleblower reward from the SEC, a significant sum that allowed me to start a new life, free from the shadow of my parents' influence. I used the money to create a foundation that supports victims of fraud and abuse, helping them to rebuild their lives and find justice. I finally felt free. In the end, I won. They lost everything. I just smiled because they earned it. Revenge isn't sweet. It's necessary. Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more justice.